and it's a description of the Prophet, which is very important because one of the things that every believer will be tested by is in the grave. It will be said to them first, who is your Lord, man rabbuka, and then what is your religion, and then what do you say about this man? And it says hadha rajul, which the Arabs use for presence, so people will actually see the Prophet ﷺ in their grave, and they should know the description so they recognize him. So that's traditionally why the hilya was very important for people. And the other thing about the hilya is what's stunning about the Prophet ﷺ's physical description is that he was balanced in everything. He was neither short nor tall. You know, he was of moderate stature. Yeah. His skin was neither pasty white nor was it dark. It was a middle color. His physical appearance was moderate. His hair was neither straight nor curly. It was wavy. That everything was balanced. So the Prophet ﷺ is a perfectly balanced human being, not just spiritually and intellectually, but also physically. And so it's very important for Muslims to remember that our religion is a religion of balance, of i'tidal. The Prophet was mu'tadil in everything. You would call all those descriptions that were given of him, that it's mu'tadil, it's in between. You know, he could have been very tall, but he wasn't. Although he always appeared taller than whoever he was with, but that was one of his miracles. So, in terms of the crises of knowledge, I mean, I believe that the crisis in the Muslim world is always a crisis of knowledge, that every crisis that the world faces is ultimately a crisis of knowledge. If you look, for instance, at the economic crisis, the real economic crisis is not about collapsing markets, it's not about derivatives, it's not about AAA loans being passed off, or single A loans being passed off as AAA loans. You know, those are all symptoms of a much deeper crisis, and the crisis is ultimately about what is economics, and then what drives human beings to greed. Why are they greedy, and why will they, because of their greed, do things that are harmful to other people? What is it in the psychological makeup of certain people that greed will be so destructive that they will actually destroy themselves as well as others? Those are all problems of knowledge. They're not so. And then political problems. Why do politicians fail so often? Because they don't utilize the knowledge they have. For instance, many of our problems now, we actually know what causes them. We have social scientists that study these things, but social science isn't used. For instance, we know what produces extremism. We know the social circumstances that produce extremism, and we know the types, the psychological profiles of people that become extremists. But that knowledge is not used. Instead, false knowledge is presented, platitudes. For instance, the Palestinians, Mark Twain visited Palestine over 100 years ago. He didn't describe them as being violent, quite the opposite. He didn't experience them as violent. We know that Florence Nightingale lived for almost 2 years in Egypt, and she also lived in Turkey, and she actually has wonderful things to say. She was troubled by certain things that she saw in the political class, but by and large she was very struck by a lot of the positive things about Islam. And so how is it that somebody over 100 years ago could write very positive things about Islam, and yet today it's very difficult for people to say anything positive about Islam, right? This is a corruption of knowledge, because Islam has been presented as something other than it is, and there's agendas behind that. So for me, all of the problems that we are confronted with, the ills of the world, are ultimately related to how we understand the world. And so understanding is central. Changing our understanding, rectifying our knowledge is really important. Well, I was struck. I was with Sayyidina Qibr Attas the other day, and he used innocent ignorance and arrogant ignorance, and I hadn't heard those terms before. Generally, the way I learned it was compounded ignorance and simple ignorance. But I actually liked the idea of using innocent ignorance and arrogant ignorance, because essentially that's getting, by saying compound ignorance and simple ignorance, you're not getting to the real problem. Because innocent ignorance is when people have a purity that enables them to say, I don't know.
Yes.
Because being able to say, I don't know, comes from, like a child.
Yes.
A child will just say, I don't know.
Yes.
Whereas, you know, there's an essay written by an American philosopher, which unfortunately he entitled it with a word that I don't say privately, so I certainly won't say it on the radio, but anyway, the initials are BS, and what he argued in that is that there was so much BS in the world, you know, and he asked the question in the essay, why is there so much you know, people just pretend to know things and they just say things and it's just rubbish. That's what the British call it, rubbish. It used to be called balderdash, just empty, kalam fadhi, you know, the Iraqis say hachi fadhi, you know, empty words. Why is there so much of that? He argues in there because people feel they have to have an opinion about everything. And that's a disease.
Yes.
Just to be able to say, I don't know. In fact, our scholars used to teach I don't know as part of knowledge. And they would say that it was half of knowledge. That if you know I don't know, you already know half of knowledge.